Everything you are most proud of either hurt the people you claim to represent or never actually happened. And that was the brutal conclusion Senator John Kennedy drove straight at Alexandria Ocasio Cortez after spending 12 relentless minutes dismantling the very accomplishments she had chosen to defend herself. Ocasio Cortez opened her mouth, but for once the words that normally came so quickly did not come at all. And when she turned toward the Democrats sitting on the committee, the people who were supposed to give her political cover when the pressure became unbearable, not one of them seemed willing to meet her eyes. Her own side had watched the entire exchange unfold, watched Kennedy take her arguments apart one piece at a time, and when the moment finally came to rescue her, they stayed silent and allowed the silence to become part of the record. But the most damaging part was not Kennedy's final accusation, and it was not even the moment when Ocasio Cortez appeared unable to answer him, because the real damage had been created 12 minutes earlier when she confidently handed Kennedy the exact list he would later use against her. She chose the three achievements she considered strongest, presented them as proof of her effectiveness, and then watched as Kennedy methodically returned to each one until the list that was supposed to protect her became the foundation of the case against her. 12 minutes before that silence, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez was still smiling, still operating in the political territory where she was normally most comfortable, speaking about inequality, billionaires, working families, and people who could not afford rent, while Democratic senators nodded and television cameras recorded every word. She delivered the kind of opening argument she had delivered countless times before, confident, polished, morally certain, structured around the familiar idea that ordinary Americans were being crushed while powerful corporations and wealthy interests controlled too much of the system. She finished strongly, settled back into her chair, and carried herself like someone who believed the central argument had already been won before Kennedy had even begun asking questions. Then Senator John Kennedy took his turn, and instead of opening with an accusation or throwing a stack of hostile statistics across the table, he asked something far more dangerous because it required Ocasio Cortez to define the standard by which her own record would be judged. He told her that after 7 years in Congress, he wanted something simple. Not bills she had introduced, not speeches she had delivered, not causes she had attached herself to, but what she had actually done for the people who elected her. Ocasio Cortez almost seemed relieved by the question because this was exactly the kind of question she had answered in interviews, speeches, rallies, and campaign appearances, and she did not appear to regard it as a trap. She leaned into the record she had spent years building and identified the Green New Deal as one of the achievements she was most proud of, describing it as an ambitious climate and economic justice plan designed to confront a crisis she believed Washington had failed to address seriously. Kennedy did not argue with her immediately, did not interrupt the answer, and did not try to change the subject because he simply wrote the answer down carefully on a yellow legal pad in blue ink. Ocasio Cortez then identified her opposition to Amazon's proposed New York expansion, saying she had stood against what she described as billions of dollars in corporate welfare, and had shown that even one of the most powerful companies on earth could be told that her community was not for sale. Kennedy wrote that answer down as well, giving it the same deliberate attention as the first, creating a written record not of his accusations, but of her own chosen accomplishments. For her third answer, Ocasio Cortez returned to the economic message at the center of her political identity, saying she had fought for Medicare for all, student debt relief, and working families who deserved a government that worked for them rather than for billionaires. Kennedy finished writing, looked down at the 3 lines now sitting on the yellow pad, and thanked her for the answers, telling her to remember them because they would come back to them before the exchange was over. Then he asked one more question, seemingly smaller than everything that had just been discussed, but politically important because it connected Ocasio-Cortez's public image to the people financially supporting her campaign. How much did her average donor contribute? she answered with the pride that had always surrounded her small dollar fundraising model, giving the number $18 and presenting it as evidence that her political movement was powered by ordinary people rather than major corporate donors or billionaire interests. Kennedy repeated the number slowly, $18, and made clear that before the afternoon was finished, he intended to examine where those $18 contributions were actually going. For the first time, the confidence on Ocasio-Cortez's face appeared to change slightly, not into panic and not into anything that could yet be called fear, but into the guarded expression of someone who suddenly understood that the questioning was moving away from slogans and toward the mechanics underneath them. Kennedy looked back down at the first achievement she had given him, the Green New Deal, and began examining the gap between the enormous scale of the promise and the practical consequences attached to the policy. He pointed to estimates that placed the possible cost at $93 trillion over 10 years, and translated that enormous figure into a number ordinary families could understand, arguing that it represented roughly $70,000 per household in the first year. His point was deliberately simple. Numbers measured in trillions can sound abstract in Washington, where politicians discuss them so casually that they almost stop sounding like money. But a household understands $70,000 because a household knows exactly what it earns, exactly what its rent costs, and exactly how quickly such a burden would overwhelm its finances. Kennedy contrasted that figure with the roughly $27,000 annual income he cited for families in her district and reduced the ideological argument to an uncomfortable arithmetic problem that could not be solved by repeating the word justice. Ocasio-Cortez responded that the Green New Deal was a non-binding resolution, a framework rather than an actual spending law, and therefore did not itself carry the enormous direct cost Kennedy was attaching to it. Kennedy immediately seized on that distinction because it created the contradiction he wanted exposed. If the resolution itself costs nothing because it does nothing directly, then the political movement surrounding it cannot simultaneously boast about the massive economic transformation it promises while dismissing questions about what implementing that transformation would eventually require. His argument was not that Washington should never propose ambitious policies, but that politicians cannot claim credit for enormous promises when campaigning and then retreat to the technical defense that the document is merely symbolic when voters begin asking what those promises would cost them. He pushed the point toward the people watching from home, particularly retirees and working families who hear the word ambitious from Washington, but must still calculate grocery bills, utility payments, medication costs, and housing every month. Then Kennedy introduced the statement attributed in the script to Ocasio-Cortez's own former chief of staff, arguing that the Green New Deal had been described not simply as a climate proposal, but as a vehicle for changing the broader economy, which Kennedy used to reinforce his claim that the economic consequences could not simply be waved away. Kennedy then shifted from the economy Ocasio-Cortez wanted to redesign to the smaller economy directly controlled by her political operation, the campaign funded by the $18 donations she had just proudly described. He opened a folder and began going through hotel expenses, including stays in Las Vegas, Tucson, and San Juan, presenting them not as isolated accounting lines, but as a direct test of whether the image sold to small dollar donors matched the way their campaign money was being spent. According to the figures contained in the script, he placed the total luxury hotel spending at more than $53,000 during 2025 alone, and the contrast practically wrote the political attack for him. People were being asked to contribute $18 at a time to fight concentrated wealth, while tens of thousands of campaign dollars were being spent on accommodations far beyond what many of those donors could comfortably afford themselves. When Ocasio-Cortez answered that campaign-related travel expenses were ordinary and lawful for members of Congress, Kennedy did not accuse her of illegality, because legality was not the standard he was trying to establish. His argument was harsher precisely because it was narrower. Something could satisfy the rules printed in Washington and still look grotesquely disconnected from the economic struggle used to persuade working people to open their wallets. Kennedy kept pressing that distinction between what was technically permitted and what was politically honest, because the entire power of Ocasio Cortez's fundraising identity depended on the belief that $18 contributions represented sacrifice, trust, and participation from people without enormous disposable incomes. The script then moved through expenses associated with the Fighting Oligarchy tour with Senator Bernie Sanders, including private air travel, Puerto Rico hotel and catering costs, and other campaign expenditures, allowing Kennedy to hammer the contradiction between the anti-oligarchy message and the expensive infrastructure surrounding the message itself. His point was not subtle and was never intended to be. If your political brand depends on condemning elite lifestyles, every luxurious expense becomes more damaging because voters judge you against the moral standard you chose to impose on everybody else. Kennedy turned toward the people watching at home and argued that many of them had already suspected this contradiction, that they had watched Ocasio-Cortez condemn inequality on television while wondering whether the political movement built around working-class struggle had created a very comfortable world for the politicians leading it. And Kennedy was only beginning, because once the $18 donor had been placed beside the $53,000 hotel bill, the next set of campaign payments would move the argument away from optics and directly toward the question of how transparently that money had been described. Kennedy moved next to 3 payments listed in the script as going to Dr. Brian Bowl, totaling $18,725, and described on campaign filings as leadership training and consulting. And this was where his attack stopped being merely about expensive travel and started becoming an argument about the accuracy of the labels attached to political spending. Kennedy said he had looked into Dr. Bowl's professional background and described him as a Harvard-trained psychiatrist whose work included ketamine therapy for depression, then argued that the description on the campaign filing did not obviously match the kind of services associated with that medical specialty. He did not need to accuse Ocasio-Cortez of anything beyond what was already sitting in the paperwork, because his entire point was that political campaigns demanding transparency from everybody else should expect brutal scrutiny when their own descriptions raise questions. When Ocasio-Cortez said she would not discuss private health matters in a Senate hearing, Kennedy immediately rejected the idea that he was asking about her health and narrowed the issue back to what he had been pressing from the beginning, what donors were told their money was paying for. In his framing, the $18 donor was no longer an inspiring symbol used in fundraising speeches, but the standard against which every hotel room, every flight, every consultant, and every line on a federal filing should be judged. Then, Kennedy turned back to the second achievement Ocasio-Cortez had proudly given him at the beginning of the hearing, her opposition to Amazon's planned expansion in Long Island City, and the temperature of the exchange changed because this time the argument was not about campaign optics, but about jobs that Kennedy said never arrived. He reminded the room that Amazon had announced plans in 2019 for a major headquarters project in Queens and attached the number that would dominate this section of the hearing. Roughly 25,000 jobs, many of them technology, engineering, administrative, and other positions capable of paying far more than the minimum wage. Kennedy cited public support for the project and argued that a large majority of New Yorkers wanted the development, making Ocasio-Cortez's opposition look, in his telling, less like grassroots resistance and more like a political decision imposed on people who would have benefited from the employment. He described her rallies, public opposition, and repeated criticism of the approximately $3 billion incentive package, then reduced the entire fight to the bluntest possible outcome. Amazon abandoned the New York plan, Virginia welcomed major investment, and Queens never received the headquarters she had helped oppose. Ocasio-Cortez had called the outcome a victory over corporate welfare, but Kennedy's attack was designed to force a far uglier question onto that word victory. Victory for whom? Kennedy pushed the argument away from corporations and toward workers because attacking Amazon was easy politically, while explaining the absence of thousands of potential paychecks was much harder, and that distinction was exactly where he wanted Ocasio-Cortez trapped. He described hypothetical single mothers working double shifts, veterans searching for stable employment, and families trying to survive in an expensive city, not as new evidence, but as the human face of his argument that economic opportunities cannot be dismissed simply because the company providing them is enormously wealthy. In Kennedy's version of the record, Ocasio-Cortez had gained headlines, followers, and national stature from fighting one of the richest corporations in America, while the people she represented were left without the jobs that had been promised. When she answered that the package amounted to corporate welfare for a $1 trillion corporation and argued that taxpayers should not subsidize Amazon, Kennedy refused to debate the company's morality and instead returned to the wages he said would have flowed into working households. His accusation was brutally simple. Ocasio-Cortez chose the political satisfaction of defeating Amazon over the practical benefit of letting thousands of residents collect paychecks from Amazon. The script then gave Kennedy his most useful weapon in that section, because he did not have to rely entirely on Republican criticism, and he reached for comments from then New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, a Democrat who had publicly condemned the politicians responsible for helping derail the project. Kennedy read the criticism as an indictment from Ocasio-Cortez's own political side, emphasizing Cuomo's accusation that a small group of politicians had placed narrow political interests above the interests of their community. That mattered to Kennedy because it allowed him to strip away the easiest defense available to Ocasio-Cortez, the argument that the entire attack was simply conservative hostility dressed up as economic analysis. He set the statement down and made the point unmistakable. This was not Fox News, not a Republican campaign advertisement, not a conservative think tank trying to manufacture outrage, but a Democratic governor attacking the same decision she had just listed as one of the proudest achievements of her congressional career. And, for the first time during that portion of the questioning, Ocasio-Cortez stopped defending the individual allegation Kennedy had placed in front of her and decided to attack the man asking the questions. She went straight at Louisiana, arguing that Kennedy had no standing to lecture her about representing struggling constituents when his own state ranked near the bottom nationally in poverty, education, and healthcare outcomes, despite his years in the United States Senate. It was the kind of counterattack Ocasio-Cortez had used effectively many times before because it shifted the burden instantly, taking her off defense and forcing the critic to explain his own failures instead of continuing to examine hers. The press table reacted, Democratic staffers appeared energized, and for a brief moment the momentum of the hearing moved back toward Ocasio-Cortez because she had finally found terrain where she could turn Kennedy from prosecutor into defendant. Kennedy did not interrupt, did not pretend Louisiana had no problems, and did not attempt the kind of evasive answer that would have handed Ocasio-Cortez an easy second strike. Instead, he acknowledged the weaknesses of his state and used that admission to construct the contrast that would become one of the sharpest lines of his entire argument. He admitted what was wrong while she had just presented the loss of 25,000 potential jobs as something worthy of pride. That response changed the direction of the exchange again, because Kennedy was no longer arguing that Louisiana represented successful government or that his own political record was beyond criticism. And by conceding the point, he deprived Ocasio-Cortez of the victory her attack was supposed to produce. His argument became that political credibility begins with admitting failure rather than marketing failure as achievement. and he accused Ocasio Cortez of doing exactly that with the Amazon fight. From there, Kennedy accelerated, no longer treating the controversies as separate episodes, but presenting them as pieces of the same pattern, one built around moral language in public and very different standards when money, influence, or personal political advantage entered the picture. He returned to September 2021 and the Met Gala, reminding the room of the now famous tax the rich dress and citing the congressional ethics findings described in the script concerning gifts, services, and payments connected to the event. Kennedy's purpose was not simply to mock a dress, it was to argue that the slogan stitched across it had become a perfect symbol of the contradiction he was trying to prove. He emphasized that the dress, accessories, transportation, and other services associated with the event had become subjects of ethics scrutiny and stressed the timing of payments, arguing that outstanding bills were addressed only after investigators began asking questions. Then he focused on designer Aurora James and her company, the kind of minority-owned small business Ocasio Cortez routinely said American policy should support, and Kennedy used the dispute over unpaid costs to sharpen the hypocrisy charge rather than broaden it. In his telling, the public image was revolutionary when cameras were present, the private response to the bill was delay, and the explanation after scrutiny arrived was that staff had failed to handle the matter properly, 3 different postures depending on who was watching. Kennedy was building towards something larger than a Met Gala controversy because the next numbers in the script involved approximately $885,000 moved from political organizations into limited liability companies associated with her former chief of staff, a transition Kennedy portrayed as money moving from a structure where spending could be easily tracked into one where the public could see considerably less. And once he placed that figure beside Ocasio Cortez's own demands for full transparency and zero tolerance for dark money, Kennedy had the contradiction he wanted. The politician who demanded that Americans see where political money went was now being forced to explain why so much money connected to her own operation had traveled through structures that made that task harder. Kennedy did not leave the money trail hanging in abstraction because his next move was to bring everything back to the people Ocasio Cortez had been elected to represent, the same working families whose hardship formed the emotional foundation of nearly every major speech she gave. He cited a district poverty rate of 18.6%, nearly 1 in 5 families, and a per capita income of roughly $27,000, about $10,000 below the New York City average, numbers that turned the hearing away from ideological arguments and toward a simple question of what 7 years of representation had actually produced for people living under those conditions. His point was not that one member of Congress could single-handedly eliminate poverty, but that a politician who built an entire national identity around fighting for struggling people should expect those people to ask what changed after years of speeches, rallies, fundraising emails, television appearances, and promises. Kennedy then moved into constituent services, citing complaints that her district office operated limited hours, that phones often went unanswered, and that residents had difficulty reaching staff without appointments, which he presented as an especially ugly contradiction for someone whose entire political brand depended on accessibility to ordinary people. The more Ocasio-Cortez talked nationally about representing the unheard, Kennedy argued, the more damaging it became when people inside her own district complained that they could not get anyone from her office to answer them. He then brought up a town hall described in the script as lasting 55 minutes with only 6 questions taken from a packed room before Ocasio-Cortez left in an SUV through the back exit, and Kennedy treated those numbers like they were evidence all by themselves. 6 questions for a district containing roughly 700,000 people was how he framed it, not because every resident could obviously speak at one meeting, but because the image perfectly fit the larger accusation he had been assembling all afternoon. Enormous time for national messaging, limited time for the people actually represented. He read constituent criticism describing Ocasio Cortez as someone who had done nothing for the community she was elected to serve and repeated the phrase absentee landlord, allowing the insult to land harder because it came not from him, but from people identified as residents of her own district. Kennedy's tone changed at this point, becoming less openly combative and more cuttingly disappointed because he no longer needed volume when the contrast itself was doing the work for him. 700,000 people, he argued, had been promised a political fighter, yet according to the complaints he cited, they were still waiting for someone to answer the phone, while the national political celebrity built around their struggles kept getting larger. Then Kennedy went after one of the most important pieces of Ocasio-Cortez's personal political story, the image of the bartender from the Bronx who had come to Washington carrying the experience of ordinary working people with her. He acknowledged that the story was powerful precisely because it connected her to voters who believed she understood what economic insecurity felt like from the inside rather than from behind a podium. But then he drew attention to her upbringing in Yorktown Heights in Westchester County, pointing to good schools, safer surroundings, and a background different from the simplified Bronx identity that had become central to her public brand. Kennedy did not claim that growing up in Westchester was itself wrong, because there was nothing wrong with it, and he did not claim that moving to the Bronx or running for office there was illegitimate, because that was not the point he needed to make. His accusation was about presentation, about choosing the version of a personal story that created maximum emotional identification with people living under harder conditions while allowing the more comfortable parts of that background to disappear from the political narrative. In Kennedy's framing, that was not a geographical technicality, but another piece of the same pattern he had been arguing from the beginning. One image for the cameras, another reality underneath it, and a political operation that depended on voters never examining the distance between the two too closely. That brought him back exactly where he had intended to return from the moment he first touched pen to yellow paper, back to the 3 answers Ocasio-Cortez had given him before she understood what those answers would become. Kennedy picked up the legal pad again, the same pad that had been sitting on the table throughout the entire exchange, and the room now understood that everything that had happened since the beginning had been organized around those 3 lines of blue ink. He reminded Ocasio-Cortez that he had asked what she was most proud of and that she had chosen the answers herself, without pressure, without interruption, and without anyone putting words into her mouth. He had not selected her weakest votes, searched for obscure legislative failures, or chosen some random controversy from years earlier and demanded that she defend it, because the entire force of his argument came from the fact that these were the accomplishments she had volunteered as the strongest evidence of her service. Now he was going to read them back in the same order she had given them and attach to each one the consequence he believed the hearing had exposed. The first line was the Green New Deal, the ambitious climate and economic plan Ocasio-Cortez had presented as one of the defining achievements of her career, and Kennedy summarized his attack by returning to the enormous projected costs, the argument that her own side had described the proposal as a vehicle for economic transformation, and the blunt reality that after 7 years, it had never become law. In his framing, that meant the proposal existed in a politically convenient space where supporters could claim credit for the scale of its promise while escaping responsibility for the cost by calling it a non-binding framework whenever the numbers became uncomfortable. Kennedy did not need to reopen the entire debate because he had already done that earlier. Now he was simply writing the verdict beside the first item she had chosen for herself. The second line was Amazon, the confrontation Ocasio-Cortez had framed as proof that she could stand against enormous corporate power and refuse billions in subsidies to one of the richest companies in the world. Kennedy reduced that achievement to the numbers he had already repeated relentlessly. Approximately 25,000 jobs that did not arrive, billions in potential wages that did not flow into New York households, and criticism from a Democratic governor who accused the politicians behind the collapse of placing narrow political interest ahead of the community. Then, Kennedy reached the third line, the broad promise to fight every day for Medicare for all, student debt relief, and working families. The part of Ocasio Cortez's answer that sounded less like one policy and more like the central mission of her entire political career. He contrasted the endless language of fighting with the much thinner legislative record described in the script, arguing that after 7 years in Congress, very little of what she had personally pushed had actually become law, which allowed him to draw a brutal distinction between activity and results. The rallies happened, the television clips happened, the social media campaigns happened, the fundraising happened, the confrontations happened, the headlines happened, but Kennedy's accusation was that the measurable outcome for the people back home never matched the scale of the political theater surrounding their representative. He set the yellow pad down slowly and reminded the room that these were not 3 attacks he had invented, but the 3 achievements Ocasio-Cortez herself had selected 12 minutes earlier when she still believed the question was helping her. And once the pad hit the table, the hearing moved toward the one question Kennedy had been building toward from the beginning, the question that would strip away legislation, slogans, ideology, headlines, and political identity and reduce 7 years in Congress to one test that could not be answered with another speech. Kennedy leaned forward and asked her to name one person in her district whose life was better because of something she had done, not a proposal, not a viral clip, not another confrontation, not a legislative aspiration, but one actual person, one family, one life that had changed because she had been there. The question was devastating precisely because it demanded specificity after an afternoon built around abstractions, forcing Ocasio-Cortez to move from millions of people in speeches to one human being in real life. The room went completely still as she opened her mouth, closed it, looked down, looked back up, drew in a breath, and searched for an answer that had always seemed unnecessary when the conversation stayed at the level of movements, systems, justice, billionaires, and national causes. Kennedy waited because at that point waiting was more effective than speaking, and every second that passed turned the absence of an answer into part of the argument he had spent the entire hearing constructing. What followed was the 12 seconds of silence the script had been moving toward from its opening line, and in those 12 seconds, Kennedy would take every contradiction he had laid on the table and compress it into the accusation that ended the afternoon. The silence stretched until it stopped feeling like a pause and started functioning as the answer itself. 12 seconds in which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been asked for one concrete life, one family, one constituent whose circumstances had materially improved because of something she had actually accomplished, and nothing came back across the microphone. Kennedy did not rush to fill the space, because he understood that anything he said too quickly would rescue her from the very moment he had spent the previous 12 minutes creating. He let the room hear the absence, let the cameras record it, let every person sitting behind the committee table understand that a politician famous for speed, certainty, and moral confidence had suddenly been reduced to searching for one name she could not immediately produce. Then Kennedy quietly said he could name 12 people in Louisiana, not with triumph in his voice, but with the controlled finality of a man claiming that his standard had already been met somewhere else. And when Ocasio-Cortez still did not answer, the silence became the bridge between every argument Kennedy had raised and the conclusion he was now ready to deliver. He returned to the figures that had defined the afternoon and compressed them into a single indictment, saying that while more than $53,000 had been spent on hotels, none of that money had gone back into Parkchester, while 25,000 potential jobs had disappeared from New York, and the loss had been celebrated as political victory. He reminded the room of the contradiction he had drawn between the Bronx identity at the center of Ocasio-Cortez's public image and the Westchester upbringing Kennedy had used to challenge that image, then brought the argument back to constituent complaints, limited access, unanswered phones, and the town hall he described as 55 minutes and 6 questions. Kennedy's purpose was no longer to debate the details because those details had already been placed on the table one by one. Now he was showing the pattern he believed they formed when viewed together. The conclusion was savage because it attacked not one policy and not one expenditure, but the entire relationship between Ocasio-Cortez and the people whose struggle powered her national political identity. Everything she had chosen as proof of her service, Kennedy argued, either failed to become reality or produced consequences that hurt the same people she claimed to be fighting for. Then came the 6 words that the script had been driving toward from the beginning. You did not fight for them. You used them. Kennedy did not smile when he said it, did not pound the desk, did not raise his voice because the line had more force without theater after an exchange built almost entirely around Ocasio-Cortez's own answers. What followed was not the ordinary silence between one senator's remarks and the next member's questions, but the heavy stillness that comes when everyone in a room understands that an argument has reached its end point and nothing said immediately afterward is likely to erase it. The chairman moved toward the next member, a senior Democrat, on the panel, and under normal Washington rules, that should have been the moment when Ocasio-Cortez received political relief. Hearings operate on rhythm. One side attacks, the other side offers a friendly question, a witness regains control, and the damage is diluted before the cameras move on. Ocasio-Cortez looked toward the Democratic senator, and the script describes that look as an unspoken request for exactly that kind of lifeline. Anything that would allow her to return to familiar ground and rebuild the image that had been battered during Kennedy's questioning. He could have asked about her legislative priorities, her district work, health care, climate policy, labor rights, student debt, or any subject where she could speak for 30 seconds without being forced back onto the yellow pad. Instead, the Democrat looked down at his papers, looked at the microphone, looked toward Ocasio-Cortez, and told the chairman that he had no questions for the witness at that time. No defense followed, no attempt to challenge Kennedy's framing, no objection to the statistics he had used, no invitation for Ocasio-Cortez to provide the answer she had failed to produce during those 12 seconds. And in a hearing where political allies normally understand instinctively when intervention is required, Kennedy's attack became even more damaging because the rescue never came. Ocasio-Cortez stared toward the senator, and the expression described in the script was not simple anger, but the realization that the people she expected to protect her had decided not to spend their own political capital trying to repair what had happened. Kennedy gathered his papers without celebrating, placed the yellow pad on top of the folder, straightened the edges, and yielded his time to the chairman with none of the visible satisfaction that would have allowed his opponents to dismiss the exchange as cheap partisan performance. The hearing continued, other members spoke, other issues were raised, but in the narrative of the script, none of it mattered because the emotional and political center of the afternoon had already been defined by the 12 minutes that ended with no answer. Ocasio-Cortez remained seated with the opening statement she had delivered earlier still in front of her, the statement about working families and the political system she had promised to challenge, but the confident atmosphere surrounding that opening had disappeared completely. Across the table, Kennedy's yellow pad remained visible with 3 lines written in blue ink: Green New Deal, Amazon, Medicare for all, her own selected achievements transformed into the structure of the attack against her. According to the script, Ocasio-Cortez eventually left the hearing room without stopping to speak to reporters, something portrayed as unusual for a politician whose career had been built partly on the ability to control political moments through immediate, forceful public responses. Reporters called after her while staff members stayed close, but she kept moving until the elevator doors closed and the cameras lost sight of her. The script interprets that final image not as the face of someone who merely lost a technical policy argument, but as someone forced to confront a version of her own record she had not expected to encounter when the hearing began. That evening, the narrative emphasizes the absence of statements from Democratic leadership, no major public defense, no coordinated claim that Kennedy's questioning had been unfair, and no visible effort to transform the hearing into a partisan outrage story. In the script's framing, that silence mattered because political parties understand when a controversy is worth fighting over, and the decision not to fight became another verdict layered on top of the one delivered inside the room. The video clip spread because the script argues that the public was less captivated by the individual controversies than by the simplicity of the final question and the 12 seconds that followed it. Hotel spending required explanations. Campaign filings required context. Met Gala ethics questions required documents. Amazon required an argument over incentives and economic development. But name one person could be understood instantly by anyone watching from a kitchen table or living room couch. The narrative returns one final time to the $18 donor, imagining an older constituent in Parkchester who had believed Ocasio-Cortez was different, who had defended her to neighbors, who had trusted that someone carrying the language of working-class struggle understood the people sending those small contributions. He watches Kennedy write down the 3 achievements, watches each one come back later as an accusation, watches the Democrat refuse to provide the expected rescue, and finally watches the silence after the question about one changed life. When the hearing ends, he turns off the television, knowing only that he gave $18 because he believed a story about who represented him, and the script closes by insisting that the story no longer looked the same. Across the country, the final argument expands beyond Ocasio-Cortez herself and toward the people who had doubted her for years, people who had been dismissed as partisan, cynical, outdated, or simply unwilling to understand what her political movement represented. In the script's telling, those viewers did not need another speech, another commentator, or another ideological argument, because the hearing had given them something they believed was simpler and more satisfying. Ocasio-Cortez's own 3 answers, Kennedy's yellow pad, and 12 seconds without a response when the standard changed from movements to results. The Green New Deal had been offered as ambition, Amazon as courage, Medicare for all as commitment, yet Kennedy had forced each claim through the same unforgiving filter of what actually happened to the people back home. That was why the yellow pad mattered more than the shouting, why the silence mattered more than the speeches, and why the refusal of a Democratic ally to step in mattered more than any partisan declaration could have mattered afterward. The entire afternoon ended where Kennedy had intended from the beginning, not with his description of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's record, but with her own description of it turned back toward her until the accomplishments she entered the room celebrating became the very evidence the script uses to argue that her political image and her actual results were never the same thing,